All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you for being with us on day one of NACCED summer meeting. My name is Laura DiMaria, and I'm the Executive Director of NACCED, which is the National Association for County, Community, and Economic Development based in Washington, D.C. And NACCED represents local governments and is a resource for affordable housing and community development professionals around the country. So we're very glad that you can be with us today and extend in particular a special welcome to NACCED non-members or those who are new to the organization and joining us for the first time. So if you want to know a little bit more about us, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at NACCED News, which is NACCED News, or our website, which is nacced.org, NACCED. So today we are kicking off NACCED summer meeting called Moving Forward Together. And this program is designed to bring together a few of the best speakers and thinkers in community development in affordable housing to discuss the state of things in 2020, what we've been through, and how we are going to proactively move forward. So we're going to talk about health and housing and eviction prevention, economic recovery, and more. So today, all of you as attendees are just in listen-only mode, with no video. Alan is going to give his presentation to us, and then we'll save Q&A for the end. At any time during the presentation, feel free to put your questions into the chat box. I'm sure by now everyone knows where that is, so go ahead and whatever you want to share with us, go ahead. And this is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later or share it with your colleagues. So to get us started on NACCED summer meeting, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker in the series, who is Alan Mallach, Senior Fellow at the Center for Community Progress based in Washington, D.C. And Alan's talk for us today is called Hope for the Best, Plan for the Worst, What Comes After COVID-19. So Alan, widely known for the knowledge and insight he brings to the challenges of revitalizing America's community, he served as the Director of Housing and Economic Development for the City of Trenton, New Jersey, as a non-resident senior fellow with the Metropolitan Policy Program of the Brookings Institution, and as a visiting scholar at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank. So he currently teaches in the Graduate City Planning Program at the Pratt Institute in New York and has lectured widely in the United States, Europe, Israel, and Japan. He's the author of many books, scholarly articles, book chapters, op-eds, blog posts, you name it, he's done it. He's also a pianist and author of 2 well-received books on 19th century Italian opera. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alan, and as he gets us started, he's got some slides he's going to share. I'm going to put the link to his report, Hope for the Best, Plan for the Worst, which today's presentation is based on, in the chat. So look for that momentarily. And Alan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Laura. And let me try to share my screen here. So, hello, everybody, and welcome to what is going to be a not happy conversation, but one that I think is incredibly important because it affects all of us. I mean, we are currently struggling through a pandemic that has had devastating effects on American people. But the biggest and most lasting effects are what's going to happen after the immediate medical crisis has come and gone, whether that's a month from now, not very likely, but conceivable, or 3 months or 6 months. Then we're going to be in a long-term process, and that's going to be a very difficult one. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk about the issues that come up in that process that are likely to affect people who are working in community development in the county and local level around the country. And some of the things that we can think about as we try to get a handle on the challenges and try to mitigate their impacts and help communities recover. So let me start with some background about, well, why isn't it, come on. There we go. Okay, sorry. I don't know how, okay. Some background about what is going on and what we can anticipate in terms of specific impacts. Okay, the first thing we know is unemployment has skyrocketed. As the chart shows, unemployment in April was almost 50% larger than the height of the Great Recession. And yes, it's come down since then, though currently a lot of economists, a lot of people who are tracking it, think the course is going to be more like this. It's going to come down, but because of what's been happening with the spread of the virus, it's not going to come down consistently. It could come down, go up a little bit, and down. But the upshot is two things. First, even if it comes down, it's going to be at hardcore recession levels, probably for at least another year to 18 months. And number two, as the chart shows, Black and Latinx people are going to be experiencing much higher unemployment than white people going forward. Second, mortgage delinquencies have already more than doubled since March, which was the last, what you might call more or less normal month. And now, at this point, this is not an immediate crisis because most people are being protected by either non-foreclosure orders at the state level or forbearance by lenders and by the federal housing agencies. But ultimately, this could become a major crisis parallel to what happened with mortgages during the Great Recession as the bottom fell out of the subprime market. Okay, rent arrears have been growing steadily. And this shows what is both important and a little scary is that it's not as if all renters are equally at risk. What this shows is that almost 1 out of 4 renters earning under $35,000 missed rent during May. And over 1 out of 4 renters with children missed rent. More affluent renters and renters without children, typically single people, some couples, are not in great shape, but are in significant better shape. So again, this is a very selective issue. It doesn't affect all renters. It affects low-income renters and renters with children, who, of course, tend to be disproportionately single moms with children and low income. So they get a double whammy. Unfortunately, the data isn't good enough to be able to sort of zoom in and find out exactly how those people are being affected, but one can assume that it's not good. Okay. Small businesses are closing. Again, it's very hard to get good real-time information on small business closings and how many small businesses that are currently temporarily closed will remain closed, will go out of business versus how many will reopen. But it's clear that it is widespread. And again, we know that small businesses in lower income communities, small businesses in communities of color tend to operate on thinner financial margins than those in more affluent communities, have less of a cushion and less ability to withstand the kind of losses that they're currently seeing. So this is likely to be very significant, and I wish we had better data on it so we could track it more effectively. And this is another interesting one because there's been a lot of stuff people read. If you read the papers, you might get the impression that home sales are rocketing back. Well, it's true in a few places. It's funny. My stepson lives in a small city in upstate New York, fairly poor city actually, and he says houses have been selling like hotcakes to people fleeing New York City. That's undoubtedly true. But if you look at the country as a whole, the overall trend is way down. So essentially the number of existing home sales in May was 27% below a year ago. And again, that will probably pick up a little bit, but generally speaking, home sales are likely to remain depressed. And again, there are going to be some markets, especially strong markets, highly desirable areas, which are going to see home sales come back very strongly. But you're going to see it just as happened with the Great Recession. The strongest areas came back fast, but many of the rest came back much more slowly. And a lot, even as of 2019, there were a lot of areas that were still basically stuck in post-foreclosure crisis, low values, low sales activities. Okay. Another thing that further compounds all the problems is the fact that both state and local governments are being clobbered financially. States that are dependent, whether it's tax revenues, sales tax revenues, income tax revenues. Detroit, for example, is being particularly hard hit fiscally because a very large chunk of Detroit's municipal budget comes from casino tax, and they have basically gotten zero over the last few months. But even as states have varied fiscal resources, most of them are going to be hit very hard. I know New Jersey, where I live, is currently contemplating borrowing up to $10 billion to meet operating shortfalls over the next 2 years. Now, everybody knows that you shouldn't borrow to meet operating costs, but this may mean the difference between the ability to continue providing essential services or not. So these are not, needless to say, normal times. Okay, so what this means, though, when we look at all of these different impacts, the first thing it's important to understand, they all reinforce each other. None of them are separate. The more small businesses close, the more people are going to be unemployed. The more evictions or foreclosures happen, the more vacant properties are going to be created, the more the housing market is going to decline. So all of these things interact. And number two, we know that they're going to disproportionately affect lower income areas and communities of color, particularly Black and Latinx people, because all of the dynamics built into our economy point in that direction. And then finally, these are not going to disappear quickly. I mean, one of the things, if you think about the CARES Act, one of the things which in retrospect seemed like a good idea at the time, but there was a kind of an implicit assumption on the part of the people who put that together that what was needed was a short-term way of stabilizing things in anticipation of a quick, what they call V-shaped recovery. So it's abundantly clear at this point that the recovery is not going to be V-shaped. We don't know what it's going to be shaped like, but it's not going to be fast and clean and easy. It's going to be a long-term effect. And one of the issues, we'll get into this, is what comes after the CARES Act. I think you probably all know that the supplemental federal unemployment benefits, the $600 checks, disappear in 2 weeks. For a family in Louisiana on unemployment, that means that their stipend is going to go from $840 a month to $240 a month. Big difference. So the key issue is that we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, this, if you look at the cases, I think a lot of people, again, a lot of people expected there would be a spike and we'd get it under control and it would go down. Well, we know very well, for all kinds of reasons that I don't have to go into, that's not what happened. It's true in some states. I'm lucky in a way. I live in New Jersey. We had a terrible spike, but we got it under control, at least for the moment. And it's come way down. But in other parts of the country, as you can see, it's taken off. And just a couple of days ago, Florida hit an all-time record for one day, one state new cases. We have no idea at this point how much higher the level of COVID-19 is going to be before it starts to go down, and when that's going to happen. So that just throws everything into huge uncertainty. So that's the picture. So what does this mean? Well, there are a lot of things going on here that are going to have a lot of impacts on neighborhoods and people. And this just kind of gives, if we have high unemployment, small business closings, and lack of consumer confidence, which is true at the moment and may persist, that in turn triggers rent arrears, mortgage arrears, fewer home sales, fewer municipal revenues, fewer county revenues, fewer state revenues, less state aid, and so forth. And that, between those two, what you're going to see in all likelihood is a lot of very visible impacts in neighborhoods. Deterioration of property, potentially more vacancy and abandonment, foreclosures. One of the big impacts of the Great Recession and the foreclosures was a loss of home ownership. That could be back. People are likely to have increasing health problems, especially behavioral health problems. The housing market is going to be weak. Property values may continue to decline. Public services, municipalities and counties have less money. They're not going to be able to provide the same level of services. There are going to be furloughs, budget cuts, aid cuts, and so forth. Homelessness is likely to increase, especially if we see a spike in evictions. And obviously poverty is going to increase. So all of these are things that could easily happen as a result of this pandemic. So the question then is, okay, what do you do? Now, I'm going to make it, just to make life even more miserable, I'm going to point out that the scale of what's going on is almost certainly beyond the resources that any individual state, county, or city has available to deal with it. And so the big wild card in all of this is, what is the federal government going to do, whether in the remaining months of this year or early next year? And that's a huge question mark, which we just have to sort of keep out there. But here are the key issues. First, trying to keep tenants in their homes, which means not just freezing rent, but trying to figure out a way that tenants can stay in their homes and landlords, especially small, undercapitalized mom and pop landlords, get enough assistance, whether through rent supplements or other programs, to not go out of business themselves. Secondly, to try to prevent foreclosures to the extent possible. And, many communities still have foreclosure prevention programs and people working in this area that were created during the foreclosure crisis and the Great Recession. I think it's time to reactivate and build on what we have. Third is keeping track of what's happening to properties in order to try to nip incipient deterioration and abandonment in the bud. I mean, one thing that I think is particularly important is to recognize that code enforcement, which some communities may see as a frill that can be cut back in these times of budgetary stringency. It's not a frill. It's an important part of the whole first responder system to what's going on in communities. Another issue is preventing small business closures. And here I think one of the critical issues, and I don't think people have focused on this enough. I mean, yes, everybody knows that small businesses have taken a terrible hit during the period when they've had to be closed, or restaurants only do curbside service, et cetera, et cetera. But what I think is important to recognize that if, let's say, tomorrow or next month or 2 months from now, businesses are given carte blanche to open and return to business as usual, they're not going to see business as usual right away. I mean, all of the data, all of the surveys indicate that people are going to be very wary of going back to indoor restaurants, shops, department stores, malls, all those sorts of things. So there's going to be an extended transition when many businesses may not have enough business, even though they're open, to sustain them. And so a lot of small businesses could reopen when they're given the green light, and then 6 months later decide that they just can't make it, unless there's some form of assistance to try to help tide them over that transition period. Another issue that we probably won't see the magnitude of for a little while yet, because typically a lot of tax bills are being paid by lenders through the mortgage escrows, and a lot of the deadlines are still yet to come. But in all likelihood, probably starting in 2021, we may see a significant drop in tax revenues. We may see significant numbers of property become eligible for tax sale or tax foreclosure. And that's another issue where we're better start thinking about how we're going to put systems in place to prevent people, especially struggling lower income homeowners, from losing their houses to tax foreclosures. Another one, which I'd say is actually, compared to some of the other issues, I'd see it as a down the road issue, but is ultimately trying to rebuild housing markets and trying to encourage home buyers back into the market, people putting their houses on the market, showing the whole process that's been interrupted, you might say. And again, I think that's something, I mean, certainly, you know, realtors are going to be thinking about it. They're already thinking about it and worrying about it. But I think it's an area where county and local governments could do a lot in terms of incentives and different programs to encourage home buyers back into the market. And then finally, the issue of how do you maintain essential services in this area. So those are basically, I think, the most critical issues that local people in the field of community development, and when I say community development, housing, economic development, all those related areas should be thinking about, because all of these directly impact the quality of life and the ultimate viability of the communities where we, all of us, work and try to sustain. So looking at the timeline, I think there's some important differences. I think the first three, rental assistance, which is both for tenants and for landlords, and help sustaining small businesses, is something where the time is really now, because landlords are losing rent and maybe find themselves in financial difficulty. Tenants are unable to pay their rent and may find themselves at risk of eviction. And now in some states, eviction takes a little while. In other states, it's almost instantaneous when you don't pay the rent. So the risk of evictions, the risks of landlords finding themselves in fiscal difficulty, and the risk of small businesses going under is an immediate risk. I put foreclosure prevention a notch down the road because first, many, probably most mortgages are currently in forbearance, and that's going to go on for at least a little while yet. Secondly, unlike evictions, which in many states can be a very fast process, most states foreclosure is not an instant process. There are delays, there are provisions for extension. There's a lot of things that can happen. So fewer homeowners are at risk of immediately losing their homes compared to renters immediately losing theirs. But over time, that's going to change. And so foreclosure prevention is something that's going to have to be ramped up and put in place for the next few years. The same is true, again, with some lag, of property tax relief and preventing tax foreclosures. Again, this is tricky because on the one hand, the cities and counties need every penny they can get. And in many states, property taxes are the principal way cities and counties finance themselves. At the same time, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to have trouble making their property tax payments. So figuring out how to find the balance between those two, is going to be very challenging, but very important. And then the one that can wait is market rebuilding. Not that it's not important, but if we don't tackle the issue of tenants and landlords, small businesses, and when we talk about a market, we're also talking about a market for commercial properties as well as residential, and foreclosure prevention and prevention of tax foreclosure as well. If we don't tackle these issues, though, they are going to trigger huge downward pressure on housing markets in areas that are relatively weak, lower income areas, so forth, to begin with. So I see that action with respect to rentals, homeowners, small businesses, and so on, is critically important in order to create a stabilized situation where it'll be feasible to start rebuilding the market over time. So that's basically it, but I'd like to leave with two big questions. And I'd like, I think everybody should think about these. The first question is, will the federal government act? And will what they do be big enough and strategic enough to make a real difference? And I got to admit, I was involved about a month or so ago in a program that involved comparing US and Canada responses and issues in this area. And one thing that I was really struck by was when Canada sat down to figure out how the federal government could help, deal with the pandemic in terms of the economic effects and so forth. Instead of coming up with 2 or 3 big pieces, they actually reached out to people in all kinds of sectors and tried to identify exactly what was needed to keep each different sector that was critical for the economy or each different community afloat. And so they ended up coming up with page after page of very specific, very targeted efforts. And I think it's been effective. And so I think the question is, first, will the federal government act again? And of course, when is a big question. And then will it be the kind of focused, effective strategies and investment that is needed to actually make the difference? Because let's face it, the federal government ultimately is the only entity that has the resources to solve these problems. I think there are a lot of things that counties and localities and states can do that can help. But the federal government is the only one that in the final analysis can print money. And that's what it takes. And frankly, I am not optimistic about short-run action between now and the end of the year. But I'm somewhat more optimistic, depending on what happens with the election, of course, that we may see something early in 2021. And that will be late, but fortunately, it won't be too late. And the second issue, I think, is more something just to think about in the communities where you work and where you live. Because one of the things I think COVID-19 has really pointed out to all of us, and I'm obviously not the first person to say this, perhaps I'm the millionth person to say this, but it's important. Our society, our economy, our process for making decisions that affect people's lives is seriously broken. We could return, God willing, to the status quo of, say, January 2020. And that would be a lot better for a lot of people than the current situation. But it would still be inadequate, both in terms of its effect on very large parts of America's population day to day, and also in terms of our ability to more successfully address the next crisis. Because I think we've got to realize this isn't the only pandemic that's ever going to happen. This isn't the only transformative crisis that we're going to see. The next one might be 5 years from now, it might be 20 years from now, but it's going to happen. So the question is, can we, as we start rebuilding, actually see this as an opportunity to address some of the systemic issues, whether it has to do with our public health systems or our housing systems, how we deal with low-income tenants who can't afford to pay the rent that is charged for the cheapest apartment in their communities. All of these systems need work. And one thing that's been kind of encouraging to me is the extent to which people are openly talking about how much work they need. That people are openly talking about the idea of turning a housing allowance for low-income people, not into a lottery where a few lucky people get housing vouchers, but into an entitlement, which is, to me, critically important for the future. So I think all of us should be thinking about this question as well. Not just how do we get back to where we were, but how do we get to something that, God willing, is better than where we were. So with that, I thank you, and I'm going to turn the screen share off, and I'm going to try to field any questions you have, though with the proviso that an awful lot of the answers are going to be, I don't know.
Thank you, Ellen. So like I mentioned, if you have questions, just put them in the chat, and I have a couple to get us started. So something that I feel like we heard a lot about in the beginning of all of this was people were talking about repurposing commercial buildings for housing. Do you think there's much potential in that as a solution?
Depends. I mean, when we look at commercial buildings, we're talking about everything from, 3 or 4 story walk-ups in old downtowns to regional shopping mall, enclosed shopping malls, everything. But some of them lend themselves to housing. It's interesting. For example, all over the country, over the last decades, people have taken pre-war factory buildings and turned them into housing. And it works really well. It's the right size, the right shape, lots of windows, not too much. On the other hand, I've yet to see anybody turn a factory built since 1950 into housing, because the whole template changed, and these are huge boxes based on artificial light, and they simply don't work for housing. So I think that's here and there's some opportunities. I know one thing that's going to be interesting. A lot of people are talking, they started talking even before the pandemic about the number of regional enclosed malls that are going to be going out of business. And now people think the pandemic is just going to accelerate that. Now, the malls themselves, those structures, don't make a whole lot of sense for housing. But what you've got there are typically, you've got single parcels of hundreds of acres, most of which are parking lots. And the parcels, if they're in most parts of the country, are incredibly adaptable to mixed use development, housing development, and so forth. So in that case, the simplest thing is usually, as a lot of developers have found, don't try to retrofit them all, knock it down and build an entirely new complex around it. So I think we're going to see a lot of people trying things, but some stuff is going to work, and a lot of buildings simply are not, especially in areas like some of the, older cities, lower income areas and so forth, where even before the pandemic, there was a significant surplus of commercial space.
Yeah, and so before we got on, before we were recording, you and I were talking about the hospitality industry in general, taking something of a hit through all of this. And so similarly, I kind of wonder if there's going to be a change in repurposing hotels, that go out of business, maybe for homeless housing, because we're seeing that happening on a temporary.
That's, you could almost say that's a natural, because, they're obviously it doesn't work for everybody, but a huge share of the homeless population are, after all, single people who would be quite content with a room in a nice building with the supportive services. So it would really be easy. I know some people have already done this, at least on a temporary basis in different cities, where different, social service agencies have effectively just block booked hotels in order to put homeless people in them now this is temporary, and the funding hasn't been organized to make it permanent, but it could be, and it would be actually a very easy thing, and it would be a lot less expensive than building new SRO housing from scratch.
Right, definitely. Yeah, and so within NACCED's membership, as I mentioned to those who are new to the organization, they're all local governments, primarily counties and cities as well. And many of them have been using the stimulus funding that they received as a part of the CARES Act to help homeless people be able to quarantine in hotels or to provide a temporary housing solution. So I would imagine that we'll see more of that. And I know we had one question that came in the chat, but before we get to that one, so because our audience is many local governments, and you mentioned a couple of things that you wanted, the attendees to be thinking about and maybe potential solutions. So what are the ones, whether it's on evictions or preventing homelessness or small business relief, which local governments, where should they start? Which of those is best for people who are working in government to address, if there is one?
All of them. Hey, well, let me talk a little bit. I think evictions and small business are probably the two most urgent ones. I mean, providing assistance to help tenants make up lost rent, which really is also providing assistance to landlords to enable them to pay their bills. The two are totally interwoven, and it drives me crazy when I read people calling for what they call canceling rents, or just simply abolishing rents, because it's a business. Landlords need the rent money in order to pay property taxes and mortgages and utility bills and exterminators and everything else. And most of them, contrary to what a lot of people believe, a lot of people have the impression that most landlords, especially in inner city areas, are large, impersonal, well-heeled corporate entities. Not true. Most of them are mom and pops. An awful lot of them are just one or two notches above their tenants on the income scale. So landlord/tenant assistance, I think, is critical. And one thing there, given that no city or county is ever going to have as much money as the sum total of the arrears, I'm hoping maybe down the road the federal government will supplement that. But until that happens, no city or county is going to have enough money to meet every demand, which means I think some communities that have created kind of open lotteries to people to apply, or first come, first served. I know Dallas did that, and they were fully subscribed in 24 hours. I think it's really important to think through strategies as to who should be prioritized. And I would think about, first, prioritize very low income people, very low income tenants, and especially very low income tenants with children, because they're the most vulnerable and the most at risk. And number two, within that, prioritize local mom and pop landlords and set up systems. Yes, it's more work for the staff, but it makes a huge difference in terms of whether you're going to be reaching people who really need it. And by the way, I'd like to mention, the city of Baltimore, which by the way, just is also a county, so it's part of your family, is the best example I know of a city that's really tried to develop an effective strategy to use what limited funds it's been able to scrounge together for this. It's worth looking at what they're trying to do. Then on the small business, again, being strategic about businesses that serve valuable community functions, businesses that are, on thin ice financially, and trying to get some help out there. And which, by the way, in a lot of cities and counties, the local officials don't necessarily know who the businesses are and where they are and what their needs are. So I think you've got to start by actually getting out there and finding out who you're talking about and making sure that you've got lines of communication with the small business community.
Great, thank you. All right, we've had a couple of questions come in, so we'll start with the short one. So why do you think stock markets are approaching all-time highs after dipping in March? Speaking of that V-shaped recovery.
Well, I think the stock market has about as much to do with the economy as it has to do with the orbit of the planet Neptune. I haven't actually graphed the stock market against the orbit of the planet Neptune, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a relationship there. Stock market is based on large corporate earnings and a whole bunch of things, as well as a whole enormous and very bizarre psychological factors, so forth, that really have nothing to do with the day-to-day functioning of the stock market. And the stock market is incredibly susceptible to rumors and expectations. And, it's like a manic depressive child where, somebody says, I think I've got a good idea for a vaccine, and it goes up 700 points. So as far as I'm concerned, if you're in the stock market, good for you. But it has absolutely nothing to do with the day-to-day economy that working people experience in their communities.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, a couple more questions. How can areas with up-and-coming or transitional housing markets protect low and moderate income housing and homeowners from being targeted by developers or displaced by gentrification should the increase in foreclosures that you predicted start to occur in a few years?
Okay, that is going to be a tough issue. I think one thing, that's been a tough issue for communities well before anybody ever heard of COVID-19, is the question, how do you protect struggling low-income people when all of a sudden their neighborhood becomes hot? And they're two different issues, whether you're talking about renters or talking about homeowners. I think until the foreclosure risk became so huge, protecting homeowners was actually relatively easy, because a homeowner ultimately will benefit from a rising market. And it's the simplest thing is to make sure that the homeowner is not hit by such tax increases in the interim that they're forced to sell before they're ready. Now, when you get into foreclosures, I think this is where it becomes complicated, because certainly it's one thing if a homeowner can just sell their house in the normal way. It's another thing if the homeowner loses the house. And I think there are a couple. First, I think, as I mentioned, foreclosure prevention and measures to make sure that no homeowner is foreclosed on where something can be done is critically important. And again, a lot of communities had pretty good machinery for this sort of thing that was developed in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. And the nucleus of that, I think, is still there in a lot of places. That's the second thing, and I think this is really important, but I'm hoping people will be a little more attuned to this sort of thing than they were initially back then, is to really work with and put pressure on the federal agencies that will be controlling, either directly or indirectly, the outcomes of foreclosures, to try to make sure that you don't have the same kind of yard sales that were going on in 2009, 10, and 11. So that if Fannie Mae ends up with thousands of properties in its portfolio through foreclosures, that they don't simply hand them over to speculators or investors, but that they have strategies built in. And they should be thinking about it now, that they have strategies to make sure that that people who go into foreclosure have a chance to sort of work their way out, and that where there's no such opportunity, that the properties are made available to organizations like it's funny, there's an organization, I don't know if you're familiar with it, called the National Community Stabilization Trust, that was created a couple of years after the foreclosure crisis to provide a vehicle for taking foreclosed properties from the federal agencies and putting them back to productive use in there to benefit the communities and the people living in them. And they did a lot of good work. And in the last couple of years, they've been actively looking for what their new missions should be, because foreclosures dropped off so much. Sad to say, they may have to gear up some of the things they were doing 5-6 years ago. So I think that's a big part of it.
Great, thank you. So we have a question coming in from Nassau County, New York. So this comes from our member, Kevin. So he says, Alan, you mentioned residents fleeing New York City for upstate suburbs. We have heard in Nassau County, businesses are also seeking cheaper space outside large cities. How do you see this impacting the real estate market in the short term? Are the residents more higher income or across the board? Also, since suburbs are less equipped mass transit, how do you see this impacting public transportation, commuting, etc.?
Okay, I think the short answer is there are just too many unknowns. So anything I say on the subject is going to be guesswork. But the community that I mentioned, it's a city called Oneonta. It's a good 3 hours from Manhattan. So it's not a suburb. I think people are looking at the idea that, if I'm going to work remotely, why should I work remotely from a 700 square foot Manhattan apartment I'm paying $3,000 a month for, when I can buy a house, a nice old Victorian house in Oneonta for $150,000. So I think that's a very different kind of thing. I don't know that that many people are going to be moving to Nassau County, for example, because Nassau County is pretty expensive for the most part, and it's also pretty close. So, but that said, I think the biggest question is, how are people, the people who live in cities today, or the people who might have been thinking about moving to cities, how are they going to be thinking about living in cities going forward? And I know if you read, a lot of urbanists, myself included, have opined on this, and the opinions are all over the map. You know, one person will basically write a very compelling piece saying that this is the end of urban revival as we know it. Another person will write an equally compelling piece saying, no problem, cities will bounce back stronger than ever. We don't know, but I think there are some significant risks. I think we already have a pretty good idea that because of increased remote working, reduced convention and visitor business, that a lot of cities are going to see significant vacant space in those sectors. That's going to, you know, that could sort of trigger other things. I mean, again, there may be, if cities no longer offer the scene, the entertainment, life, variety, dynamism, et cetera, that they've done historically and that have drawn millions of highly educated young people into the cities in the United States in the last 2 decades. That could mean that a lot of people might start thinking differently about the cities. If the more remote work, the less people are going to feel the desirability of going downtown on a subway and getting into an elevator with a whole bunch of other people to go up 40 floors, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of big question marks there. I'm not convinced that the cities are going to wither away. I doubt it. But I think there might be some very difficult adjustments going on for quite a few years.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I tend to feel like cities seem to be more recession proof than, you know, maybe the suburbs or rural areas, just because, as you're saying, there's entertainment and there's bars and different things to do. But if none of those things can be open, then.
Well, that was it's interesting. I think there are sort of 2 thoughts along those lines. One is, you know, the cities had a pretty good run from pretty much the end of the millennium on up for a bunch of years. And then everybody kind of, when the recession of the foreclosure crisis hit, everybody who was in the sort of urbanism business was wondering, what's going to happen? Does this mean, because everybody knew that the revival was barely getting started. Is this going to be the end of that? Well, the interesting thing is it wasn't. And in fact, most cities basically took a deep breath and things picked up. If you look, for example, if you look at the house price curve in Washington, D.C., starting in 2000, it goes like this to 2007 or 2008, little hiccup, and then straight back up again. So clearly that did not change the recession, the foreclosure crisis. It didn't change the basic underlying attractions of what were drawing people to cities. It was a hiccup, basically. Big hiccup, but a hiccup. The other thing, though, which is important, is that we live in a country where prosperity and investment and migration are extraordinarily unevenly distributed spatially. So it's funny, when we read the papers about all this rampant housing crisis, gentrification, and so forth, it's almost all written by people who live either in New York City, Washington, D.C., or San Francisco. You go to St. Louis, I mean, you can buy a beautiful house in the best neighborhood of St. Louis for $250,000, for $250,000, which pretty much a middle-income family can afford. So the question is, we have some dynamo cities in this country, like San Francisco or Seattle or New York, and they may take a hit, but there's so much investment and so much talent and so much money in those places. I think they'll probably come back fairly strong. But places like, Detroit, for example, which have started to see some very dynamic revival, but it's only affecting a very small part of the city so far. Will they be able to sustain that, especially if the municipal budget takes a huge hit and they can no longer provide decent public services? Small cities, rural areas, I think, we have more poverty, vacant housing, and so forth in many of our rural areas than in our most distressed cities. You look at parts of Appalachia, parts of the Plain States, they're hemorrhaging. And so are they going to be able to come back at all? So I think we're going to see a very uneven pattern where unless, and again, big question, unless there's some sort of concerted federal response, we may see, again, the strong get stronger and the weak gradually fall out of the game.
Yeah, well, and I think it's, as you're saying, there's just so many unknowns at this time, and maybe that's kind of the bottom line, isn't it?
Everything I'm saying is pure speculation. It's informed as best I can be, but it's still speculation.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll have to have you back in 6 months, a year, and see which of your predictions.
I'll say, God, was I wrong.
You still won't be wrong about the stock market and Neptune, though.
Yeah. I'll run the numbers on that.
Yeah. Well, Alan, thank you so much for being with us today. Everybody, if you enjoyed today's talk, you can tweet at us at NACCED News. Tell us what you thought. Certainly download Alan's report and stay connected to the Center for Community Progress. So thank you, Alan. And I hope everyone who is on today will join us again tomorrow. Same time, same place. We're going to be hearing from National Income Housing Coalition CEO Diane Yentel, and she'll be giving a talk called Ensuring Housing Stability During and After COVID-19. So we'll be talking a little bit more about getting a little more into the eviction related issues tomorrow. So thanks again. Thanks for being with us, and everybody be well, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.